Good. My name's Johnny. I'm one of the organisers, along with fellow ACC colleague Sharon Docherty, and we're working with our colleagues at Bournemouth University, Becca and Naomi, who are at the back at the door there. And welcome to the third Cafe Scientifique. So just a little bit of housekeeping first before I introduce our interesting talk for tonight. In case any of you are unfamiliar or if this is your first time here, the whole point is to bring science to you, if you like, to bring academics out of the university environment and into a more comfortable cafe atmosphere so we can all learn something. But it's a two-way process as well, so there will be plenty of opportunity for asking questions. Just to mention that there will be some photos getting taken tonight which might get posted on the internet. If anyone has any objections to that, could you please let us know. The talk will also be filmed, but it's only going to be filming at the front, so the speaker and the screen, and that will be available at some point on the internet for you to review or let your friends know about who weren't able to make it tonight. What was the next? I've got my list here because I keep forgetting what to say. If any of you use Twitter, please feel free to chat away. The hashtag is it's hashtag Cafe Sci Boscombe, all one word. If you've got anything, if there's anything interesting tonight that you want to share with the world. The venue is provided free of charge, and the speakers come and speak out of their own time free of charge as well. But we like to help them out with travel expenses. So I would ask if you wouldn't mind putting just a very small donation. There'll be a collection jar at the back left if you'd like to deposit something to help with travel expenses. And that was basically all the housekeeping. Oh, the last thing is let us know what you think and let us know the sort of topics you want to hear about. Hopefully it's on one of the tables around, or if you can't see any, please ask us for a feedback form. Let us know what you think and of any future, any topics you'd like to hear covered in future talks. And also on our website we'll let us know about what all the future talks are. I'll let you know about the web details later because I've been talking long enough. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers, which are Dr. Roger Herbert and Josie Pegg from Bournemouth University, who've been studying the surf reef for the past few years, particularly the marine life that's been accumulating in the surf reef. So a topic that's of very much of local interest, and I hope you very much enjoy it. I'll hand you over to Roger and Josie.
Well, good evening everybody. I'm not sure yet exactly where I'm going to stand, so I might sort of move around a bit. I'd like to sort of make sure I've got some eye contact with as many of you as possible. I'm Roger, this is Josie. Josie has been working on the Surf Reef project for 2 or 3 years as a research assistant, and she knows an awful lot about it, probably more so than I do in many respects. Josie is now a PhD student at the university. We're both in the School of Applied Sciences. We get up to all sorts of interesting things. Mostly Josie and I are in the water, either in rivers or on the seashore, or well, it's not difficult to find water at the moment, so it's quite nice to be in the dry for this evening's talk. Great to be with you. We've got a lot of different media which we're going to use this evening, so I hope it all works out. We've got bits of video. We'd like to ask you some questions. We've brought some of our kit along, and do feel free to ask questions. There will be some fixed times for asking questions, but I might just throw 1 or 2 at you as well in the course of the evening, if that's all right with you. As Johnny said, this is very much of local interest. We couldn't get much closer to the reef, a little bit closer perhaps. We've been studying it for the last 3 or 4 years, but we haven't been involved in its design. and we know that of course it has had mixed press over the few years, but we'd like to share with you some of our findings, what life is like down there. We have still got a way to go before we analyse the results more fully, so bear with us a little bit in that respect. Can you all hear me at the back? Yes? Okay. I hope I pressed the right button. Well, of course, the first slide inevitably is a location slide. We all know where Boscombe is. I'm hoping I won't trip over this leaf now. I'm going to come a bit closer. Really just to, I'll move back in a minute, but just really to sort of point out where the reef is. So that is the outline of the reef. It's about 250 metres offshore. It lies sort of northeast southwest in orientation, sort of like a lozenge shape. That little yellow line, dot there marks one of our fixed monitoring sites, although we do crawl around the reef in its entirety and sample around its perimeter. But the video, some of the videos which will show you, and some of the shots are taken around about that on the sort of eastern side of the structure. You've probably seen these pictures in the press, but just to remind you of what it looks like underwater. As you can see, the picture on the bottom right there illustrates an aerial view of what it was like when it was being constructed. And unusually it's made out of sandbags. And you probably, if you're local, you probably remember when it was being constructed, and they pumped local sand into the bags, and I've heard somebody say it looks a bit like sausages of marzipan laid over each other. And the idea, of course, is that the reef creates a ramp that will create a wave for surfing on. There is certainly a lot of energy around the structure. Divers say that there's a lot of you can really feel the waves down there, and because it's so shallow and it's only 5 or 6, 7 metres at the max at high tide, if you're diving down there you do get moved around quite a bit. If you're diving down to 10 or 12 metres, then you can get away from the waves at the top, but it's quite a shallow dive and there's a lot of energy around it. Josie's going to talk more about the diving a bit later on. So it's been constructed, already there are a few problems with it. A couple of the sandbags have burst along the top. We're not quite sure exactly how that has happened, but boats hitting the reef were thought to have been one of the main causes. We'd like to ask you some questions to begin with. And I want you to be thinking about these in the course of our talk. Does the animal and plant life on the reef, the biodiversity of the reef, differ from other areas of Poole Bay? In other words, what difference has the reef made in terms of biodiversity and ecology? Could the reef also change the fish community of the whole of the bay? Now, artificial reefs have been used worldwide to restore fisheries that have been damaged in some way. An area has been overfished, hardly anything left. Artificial reefs have been used successfully as a way of creating a habitat for juvenile fish to actually spawn on, and the young fish then stay around the reef for a bit where perhaps there's a bit more shelter, and eventually they grow on and become spawners themselves, and eventually areas which had been depleted of fish are restored. So could the reef actually have some wider benefit for restoring the fishery in Poole Bay? The third question is, are the species that are colonising the reef friendly, nice species? Because sometimes when you put things into the environment, they're colonised very quickly by opportunist species, some of which are non-native. And some of these non-natives can be invasive and cause problems. So we'll be talking a little bit about that, but you might need to keep listening because we're not going to dwell on it until the end. So we want to allow you to evaluate the discussion and make some judgment yourselves, and then we can bring in the comments together. And then fourthly, you know, what can be learned? Not so much as how to make a surf reef, but is there anything that we have learned through our studies that we can perhaps transfer to the science and engineering of artificial reefs, and for recreation, as well as obviously to enhance biodiversity? So to start off with, how have we actually gone about doing work on the surf reef? What have we done? What kit have we used? Well, here's a list of things that we have used, and I'm going to show or point out a few of those to you now. Josie's going to talk more about the scuba diving a bit later on. But as well as before we started to go down and survey the animal and plant life, we wanted to be sure that we knew the structure quite well. So we did some underwater acoustic survey using a thing called a side scan. We looked at the depth profile of the area in the construction phase, and that is currently being monitored as well, see if the structure actually changes the sea depth in any way around the structure. We've been asked to look at what is happening to life on the seabed around the structure. So on the sandy seabed, away from the sandbags, does it actually affect the seabed at all? So does it affect the size and shape of the sand particles? Does it affect the amount of organic matter, living and dead material in amongst the sand? And for that, what we've been doing is taking grab samples. So that's what I was carrying in earlier. You can see this great structure here. This is called a Van Veen grab. And what you do is you hang this over the back of a survey vessel or fishing boat, if it's got an A-frame at the back of it and a winch system. And you lower it, and then you drop it onto the seabed, and there's a little catch which unlocks, and when you then haul the grab back up to the surface, it takes a chunk of sand with it. And then you hopefully get it on the deck and take the sand out, put it in buckets, and then we get some of our students to actually sieve it and pick all the worms out from it, and then we do a lot of counting and measurements and that sort of thing to determine whether in fact the reef itself is having an effect. And of course we also do that in another area where well away from the reef. That's what we call a control area or a reference area, to see whether in fact it is different from what is around the structure itself. We've also been asked to look at plankton. I'm just going to grab my little plankton net. This thing here we can tow behind a boat, and for a couple of minutes. Plankton are microscopic organisms that live in the water column. They don't normally have big legs or anything like that, so they're really at the mercy of the tides and the currents. So we have to sort of catch them in a net. We tow the net very slowly, otherwise we create a bow wave in front of the net and things don't go through it. And the mesh of this net is small enough to catch the zooplankton, the animal plankton, and at the end of our tow we just take the end off and then dunk that mesh screen into some water, and then plankton float off, and then we can have a look at them later. So that's a plankton net. We've also been using this thing here, which is being called a true trap, and what we've done is we've put these around the reef. The way it fits together is like that, so it's nothing too technical, but those who are at the front may have noticed it's got a torch in the front, because as you may know, a lot of marine life is attracted to the light. So we suspend this in the water column. It's about 1.5 metres below the surface. We have a buoy at the top to remind us where we left it, and it's got a little anchor chain at the bottom, so hopefully it stays there overnight. And the light shines throughout the night. It's got a 24-hour battery life, So we put it in the water, remembering to turn the torch on first, and then things are attracted to the light. This is gaffer tape, this top here is gaffer taped to the main bottle, and we leave it there. And things go in, so small fish, squid, cuttlefish, and then we can see what's in there in the morning and can take samples and record what's there. So we've been setting these true traps around the reef and again in a controlled area about a kilometre to the east, in a similar depth of water, to try and create a similar environment but away from the structure itself. So I'll be referring to that a bit later on as well. The other thing that we've been doing is taking some underwater video. We've used a remotely operated vehicle, which Josie will talk about later on. This thing here is what we call a bait cam, which is like high-tech crabbing. And it's a bit tricky to hold up, but basically what we've got is a simple little GoPro camera there, underwater housing. This is a bit perhaps OTT, this frame, for the kind of environment that we're working in down the reef. But we have this stick fixed to the front of the camera like this, with a piece of mackerel on the end of it as bait. And then we have the video going all the time to see what comes and chews at the bait. And this is a way of sampling the fish and other mobile invertebrates around the structure. Now we've only just started doing this, but a bit later on we've got a small video clip for you to have a look at from one of our early attempts. The problem with sampling fish, thanks Josie, and mobile animals down when you're diving is that you're disturbing them. So we don't really know what's there. So by having a static video remotely, away from any disturbance, going on all the time, is a way of sampling those kind of organisms. So a few slides just to sort of illustrate what I've been doing. This is a side scan sonar. This is what we call the fish bit of the sonar, and basically it helps us to understand what the seabed is like, whether there are any obstacles on the seabed, and importantly it tells us that the surf reef is still there. For example, there is a side scan image taken of the surf reef, and you can see the sandbag structures. It'll also help us to understand what the materials are like down there as well. This is a bathymetric survey, so this is a detailed sea depth chart of the area. Now these are being carried out by the council on a regular basis to see whether the reef is actually changing the nature of the beach. Now I'm going to try and explain what's going on here, because this diagram is showing the change in the seabed between May and September 2010. So it's over a few months. Now the red areas are areas where the beach has built up over that period. Right? And if you look at the scale there, we're talking about 0.3 metres to 0.6 metres being the reddest of those red areas. That's building up of the beach. At the other extreme, the blue areas show areas where the seabed has been scoured away over that period. Scoured by up to a metre, as you can see perhaps from the scale, between about 0.3 and 1.6. It's quite a big range there of the seabed scoured out over that same period. Now of course we can compare seasonal changes. There's bound to be a lot of natural changes, but I wonder whether you can see any pattern around the structure itself. Does anybody see anything that you might observe which could be a particular shape that might be of interest? I don't know if you can look at the north.
Is it the fin type?
Yes, that's a wonderful way of describing it. The fin-shaped pattern. Actually, I can use this as a stick. Oh no, there we go. See that? You can see that just in front of the structure, between the structure and the beach, there seems to be a fin-shaped pattern which we think is some scour that's occurring on the seabed away just as a result of the reef being there. Now we don't know yet, because we haven't analysed all the data, how persistent that is, but it's an interesting feature. There's been quite a lot of change on the structure itself. I don't know if anybody might think what that could be. It could be just be error, but what might you expect to change on the surface of the reef over the course of a year, the summer? Yeah.
For the fin shape thing.
Yeah.
Is it, you know, when you were just on the beach and you put your finger in sand or something, it fills up around it and goes down?
Yeah. We think it's something similar.
Yeah.
Again, not quite sure. We've got a lot of measurements to take yet. But on the structure itself, we think that the changes that you see there, the red and the blue, are seaweed, on the summer seaweed growth on the surface of the structure. Not that the sandbags are eroding away or anything like that, but we think it's just the seaweed and the affecting the bathymetry. So I mentioned that we've done some grab surveys, and this is our kind of what we do. So you can see a very simple diagram here showing the reef, and then we were wanting to know whether the reef affected life in the sand around the reef. So you can see reef RW and RE are our sampling areas to the west of the reef, RW, and RE to the east of the reef. And then we've got an area to the south of the reef, RS, and then the other patches, CE is a control area away from the reef, CW, control area to the west, and CS, control area to the south. So see whether in fact there's any difference between the area around the reef and the control area. So that's our sort of design. And we took grab samples using that grab in 2 patches within each of those circles there. And then we've analysed the results. Here we are on deck, sorting out the samples. The most common thing that lives on the seabed that you can see is a hermit crab. There are loads of these hermit crabs around, scuttling around on the seabed all the time. It's a thing called Diogenes. There are also little shrimps and worms actually in the sediment. But generally speaking, the variety of things in the sand is quite low diversity. There isn't much, but the hermit crabs are quite conspicuous. So we know you like graphs, and here's a graph showing the number of species which we find around the reef and in a controlled area. So the 3 groups of bars to the left have got an R in front of their little code there. RS, RW and RE is the number of species around the reef, and to the right, those with C in front of them is a controlled area away from the reef, and you can see it goes up and down. Each year it goes up and down because life in the sea is incredibly changeable. It's very, very variable. So it's a real challenge to try and to see whether there's any real difference that could be attributed to the reef or not. So we have to take lots of samples on a regular basis to see whether there is any trend. You can see that by the height of the red bars that 2009 was a bumper year, but 2010 was pretty well low everywhere, not just in the control area but around the reef as well. And certainly up until 2010 we couldn't really see any trend in the data as far as life around the reef on the seabed is concerned. And we were sampling 25 metres away from the reef structure itself. So we weren't able to get out on the reef in 2011. The weather was so bad, but we did manage this year remarkably. That data is still being worked up. And this is really a graph really to see whether the samples show any pattern. The red triangles are the types of animals and the community of animals that we find around the reef in the sand, and the inverted blue triangles are in the control area. You can see there's no distinction between the red and the blue. So the animals and the animals in the sand around the reef and in the control area is pretty much all mixed up. Here we are about to deploy the true traps. Around the reef you can see we're pretty well organised on the boat. You have to be very well organised, otherwise things go pear-shaped very, very quickly when you're working at sea. It's a very challenging environment, even on the sea at Boscombe. We can only really work on the reef when the wind is offshore, when the sea is calm around the structure. So that means waiting for northerly winds, and we all know that northerly winds are cold, especially in the spring and the autumn. So it's not always very pleasant. And very quickly, more graphs, which we know you love. Lots of results still coming in, but you can see there's a whole list of different species. They've got funny names on the bottom there. Fish you might recognise on the far right there. But you can see that the colour of the light blue bars and the dark blue bars is, well, the size of them is pretty much the same. There's not really any outstanding difference between the plankton and the juvenile fish around the structure and in the control area nearby. So what's living in the water and what's living in the sand on the seabed doesn't seem to sort of change much, or hasn't yet, at least. I'm going to hand over to Josie. Right there.
Yep, okay. When the reef was first being discussed, even in the planning stages, concerns were raised by the local Fishermen's Association that it might impact the fishery. And this is commercial fishermen, not recreational anglers. So people who were concerned that their livelihood might be impacted by building the reef. So in the sort of very early planning stages, it was decided that a fisheries survey should be carried out to look at the impact of the surf reef on the commercial fishery. How we actually did this in terms of the work was that we worked with the fishermen. As Roger discussed before, we studied both the area that they fished adjacent to the surf reef, as well as a control site for comparative purposes. Over a course of several years, once a month, the fishers would go out, deploy their trammel nets, which are tangle nets, so fairly non-selective gears, bring the catch to us rather than for sale, and we would look at what they were catching and look at any differences in the fish that they were landing. We got a lot of species. We got 28 different fish species. This is a selection of some that were caught very commonly. We've got the bib or pout, mackerel. We've got some flatfish, which are sort of a nice commercial species, plaice and sole, cod and horse mackerel. So that's just sort of a typical selection of the fish that are being caught right out here. We looked at these fish both in terms of the species that were landed, the size of the fish that were landed, the condition of the fish that were landed, so whether they were any difference in weight. We also looked at their fecundity, so what reproductive capacity they had between the two areas to see if there was any differences. And we found absolutely no difference whatsoever. There was obviously minor variation, but really in the commercial catch over an extended period, there was no difference between the control catch and the catch adjacent to the surf reef. We also looked at their diet. I've included this slide really in case anybody thinks being a marine biologist is a delightfully glamorous job. That's approximately 500 stomach contents of local fish. It smelt roughly like the bottom of my wheelie bin, and it took me several weeks to go through to find out that, again, there was no difference between the two sites. So we've looked at what's in the sediment, we've looked at the plankton in the water, and we've looked at the commercial fisheries catch. So the obvious step now is to look actually at the reef itself. What's on the actual structure and how it's been colonised over time, how that's changed, and how that compares to other equivalent structures in the locality. We've done this by actually getting down in the water and looking at it. We've used remote operated videos, and we've also sent dive teams down. In this instance, our reference sites were other hard structures in the locality, one being Boscombe Pier, and the other being Durley Rocks, which is a natural rocky reef a few hundred metres to the west. And of course, the surf reef itself. Now, when you go diving in the tropics, you can expect to have a really great dive. It's very beautiful. You'll see a lot of fish and a lot of life. When you go shallow diving in the UK, this is what you might expect. So it was with some trepidation the first day that I entered the water around Boscombe Surf Reef. However, I was really surprised, as was everybody on that boat. It was an experienced dive team. I think we were all going down expecting to see not very much and not have a very exciting dive, but actually there was a lot of life on it, and there has been a lot of life and a lot of excitement from a biological perspective every time we've gone under the water. I'm going to talk through now really just a few slides of the groups of animals that we saw and why we were interested. Well, firstly, just to cover the plants. When you're looking at plants in an aquatic environment, the colour of the plant is quite interesting. In very shallow waters, you tend to get your green algae. This is because the different chlorophylls, and so the different colours of the plant, pick up different lights at different intensities. When in very sort of shallow water, a lot of light penetrates, so the green algae thrive. As the light is dissipated through the water column, there's less light travelling through, and different pigments are needed by the plants in order to photosynthesize. So the deeper the water, you will have the green algae, then brown and red algae. Now, the distance that it takes to see these changes is indicative of the clarity of the water. If you're diving somewhere you've got very, very clear water, you'll often get green algae quite deep. But here on the surf reef, the green algae was really limited to the surface of the reef, whereas on the sides of the reef, where there was less light, because it's really quite a turbid environment, it was dominated by red and brown algae, particularly the sort of tough calcareous seaweeds that are able to survive in the high energy environment. There are a lot of sponges on the reef. If you're wondering whether a sponge is a plant or an animal, it's an animal. It doesn't look particularly like an animal because it doesn't move or have a distinctive form, but it is an animal. It's attached to the reef and its food comes to it through the water column. The more of these filter feeding creatures you get in an environment, the more you can sort of infer that there's a good flow of water and there's a lot of food provided for these animals to survive. And we found quite a diversity of sponges on the reef. We also recorded quite a few cnidarians. Cnidarians belong to the group of animal that includes the corals in tropical environments. They're animals with stinging cells that are attached. They don't move, with the exception of animals like jellyfish, but they're attached to a substrate and then they feed by shooting their prey with tiny stinging cells and then eating them. That isn't what's going on in this picture. That little crab, it's a little crab called Inachus, and it's actually living within the Dahlia anemone in the same way that an anemone fish will live within an anemone. It's a cooperative arrangement. The anemone benefits because Inachus are messy eaters, so they're providing extra food for the anemone, and obviously the anemone offers some protection for the little crab. We also recorded quite a lot of worms. This might not sound very exciting, but from an ecosystem point of view, it is. Firstly, because worms tend to be burrowers. So by recording certain worms, such as the well, the green blob to the right of that image is a paddleworm egg. Paddleworms are burrowers, so obviously it suggests that enough sediment has piled up on the reef that actually burrowing animals can live on top of the reef. The other attach worm is quite interesting because obviously as soon as animals like this start attaching, they in themselves are creating a substrate on which other animals can live. I don't know whether you can see here, there's actually teeny tiny shells living on the worm, living on the surf reef. Moving up into the bigger animals, the crustaceans, so this is your crabs, lobsters, shrimps. You're actually getting into some quite big animals. I think from the shore it's kind of hard to imagine just how big the surf reef is. It's about the size of a football pitch. So if you're thinking of what could live there, well, if you've got something football pitch size with sort of, you know, quite a bit of depth to it, you can actually get some quite big animals. The main picture is a spiny spider crab. These can get up sort of 1/2 metre in size here. They get even bigger in other areas. And again, they're something that's sort of commercially harvested for crab meat. Again, a lobster, you know, it can be quite a big animal. But within the surf reef, there is habitat for animals like this can live. Conversely, if you think of like little crustaceans, you're going right down to the tiny hermit crabs, and even smaller still, the barnacles. Also thinking about attached animals or unattached animals is the mollusks. This is a nudibranch. He made the mollusk slide because it's a really pretty picture. Actually, again, from sort of an ecological perspective, probably more interesting if we're talking about mollusks is things like the mussels. Again, there's something you'll see down every groin on the beach, but mussels are really sort of biologically interesting because when you have a patch of mussels, they actually create a really sort of diverse habitat all of their own. Mussel beds are a recognised biotope, which means they are their own ecosystem habitat. And the fact that on the surf reef there have been periods when there have been quite large numbers of mussels and then other periods when there have been less so is sort of quite interesting if we're thinking about what's going on with the ecology. There's also other mollusks like, this is a carophila, which is a native nudibranch, and it's just a really lovely thing to see. If you're wondering why it isn't eaten, these guys have got a really sort of clever defence mechanism in that they feed on the cnidarians, so anything with stinging cells, they'll eat, they don't get stung, but they store it up in these filaments on their back called serrata, and then if anything eats them, they're actually full of all this toxins from the other animals, which is pretty cool. The final group of invertebrates that we found on the reef was the ascidians. This might not be something that you'll ever see on the seashore because they're soft-bodied animals, commonly known as the sea squirt. These animals are actually very distant relatives of us, although you might not think that looking at them. Sea squirts are hemichordates, so we're chordates, meaning that we have a spinal column. These are hemichordates because in their planktonic phase they do have a sort of vestigial brain and spinal column, and they look a little bit like a tadpole as plankton, but then they float along, they find somewhere that they want to live, for example a surf reef or any other hard structure to attach to. They become attached, they dissolve their own brain, sit on the substrate, and then they spend the rest of their life chilling, feeding, with the occasional reproduction thrown in. So if you're thinking they don't look particularly related, think about those facts and think of some of the people you know, and you know, they're not that distant relatives. Again, from a biological perspective, these were very interesting because they were some of the first colonisers, and they're also one of the most diverse groups. They're also interesting because amongst the ascidians we also observe quite a lot of non-native species, which is something that I'll talk a little bit more in a moment. But we got in the teens in terms of numbers of species of ascidians. some fish on the reef. This is a pipefish, possibly slightly less charismatic than its relative, the seahorse, which obviously, you know, we have the very sort of famous studland seahorses. But one of the things that I thought was very exciting about the surf reef was, having dived a lot in the Poole Bay area, is that you see the odd pipefish. They're not particularly uncommon. This is a common larger greater pipefish, and you will see them around, but actually on the surf reef they were such high numbers that every single diver that dived the reef saw these, and I've no idea why. I've no idea what quality the reef had that made the pipefish really love it, but there was something about it, and the densities of greater pipefish on the surf reef, I can sort of confidently say, are probably greater than anywhere else I've ever dived. So it's a little mystery, but you know, they obviously like something about it. What I'm going to show you now is actually some video footage that we took on the dive. This was a dive that we carried out back in 2010 on a particularly nice day. The cameraman is Ken Collins from the National Oceanographic Institute. Ken was working with us for the duration of the project. So this is us entering the water. You can see when he looks around the distance to the shore. You can also see it's a really nice sunny day. Ken's diving at the point, the yellow dot marked on the early slide that Roger pointed out. You can see here both the surf reef, but also how little features there is around it. It's actually taking a picture of a pipefish here. If you look underneath Jenny's hands, you can see the tail. There it is. It's the tail of a pipefish. One of many. So at this point they're moving around the reef, and you can sort of see at the edge, I think perhaps the graphics give you an idea that it's really sort of soft and round and a little bit like a lilo. But you can see on this video that the edges are quite sort of jagged, which is great if you're an animal. The more sort of diversity of substrate, the more diversity of habitat and home you find. The base of these rocks, you can see how the shells and pebbles have actually piled up next to the reef. That's quite a good image for showing you sort of just how pointed it can be. You can also see some of the ascidians on it. These are the sea squirts. This is one of the spiny spider crabs. That guy's probably about 15-20 centimetres. It's not a huge individual. Looking at this slightly older video, this is, as I say, this was 2010 that this piece of video was taken. You can see that the algae is quite patchy. Actually, if we had a video for this year, which based on the weather unfortunately we don't have, what you'd actually be able to see is that there's much more coverage than there was when this was taken. If you look there at the sort of overhanging section, what you can actually see, there's some sponge, but those sort of large fronds coming down are actually squid eggs. So he's photographing, just gone off screen, squid eggs. So you can see the gullies, you can see just how quite a natural looking environment you've got, although it's a very artificial structure, and although at this point, you know, it was still only 18 months old, it's actually looking, if you didn't know it was artificial, you could easily be fooled into thinking that this was a sort of natural substrate. Here, Ken's a little bit higher up on the reef, and you can see how the coverage changes from sort of animal rich and red and brown algae rich cover to the sort of greener algae at the surface. You also get an impression of sort of just how limited your visibility is down there. This was actually a really nice day, but you saw there where Ken kicked up the sediment, how easily it clouds up, and how really when you're working as a dive team, we can only dive when the conditions are very, very calm. You see the algae moving around, and this is a pretty much flat, calm day in June. Ken's filling out his dive slate. When we were diving, we were recording everything we saw. The method of recording was one called Sea Search, which is part of a sort of national marine recording scheme, and we work with the Dorset Wildlife Trust, who sort of administer it in the area. So you can really see here how, whilst it's very, very calm on the surface, you've really got quite a lot of sort of motion under the water, and what a sort of high energy environment it is that the marine life on the reef is existing in. If you're wondering what's happening now, Ken is actually collecting sediment samples off the reef. I won't get in front of it too much, but if you can see, he's got a little chisel, and there's actually a sort of suction pump here where he's sucking a small area that's been monitored year on year, and that all goes back to the lab for sort of further detailed analysis of the really small stuff. If it looks a little bit destructive, bear in mind that this is a huge structure. It's only a really limited patch, and actually there's no sort of contact with the substrate below. Again, you can see Ken moving over. You can see how in this section the reef actually slopes down into the sand and sort of merges quite gently with the sand, whereas over the other section where he was looking, you can see where it was much rockier and where there were stones and shells and such like piled up at the base. That's an empty shell. The advantage of all the photographs that were taken is that whilst you're on the reef, you're really limited to an hour's dive time. Obviously, the more photographs we take, we then have a huge opportunity later to go back and review them, carry out further analysis and so on, some of which I'll talk about shortly. So this is a dive completed. Ken and Jenny have got their buoy up and they're returning to the surface. And again, you can see the clarity of the water, but also how quickly it becomes quite dark in quite a shallow depth. They're at about sort of 5-6 metres. And again, you can look at back and see quite how close to the shore they are and where they are positioned. Okay. Okay, Okay, I'm going to sort of break you back into part 2 of the talk gently with another video. This is a really short one. It's video that's taken using the baited camera trap that Roger showed. So it's just a couple of minutes, but what we'd really like you to do is actually see what you can see on it. We've watched this video, so we know what's on it, but we'd really like you to sort of have a go. It's in many ways much more representative, this video. You'll see that it's much less clear than our really lovely, you know, dive video. But you can still see life on it. So I'm just going to leave it to play. If you can take notes or take mental notes or just watch it and enjoy. And then we'll discuss it afterwards.
We'll have a little discussion about what you've seen. So if you've got a pencil and paper handy, maybe you want to tweet your records, or maybe that's a stage too far. I don't know. You've really got to keep your eyes open. So you're doing some real recording, real science from this short video clip. All right, so eyes peeled. Okay, here we have the bait being fixed to the arm of the bait cam. And it's being lowered over the side of the boat. Into the water, and that's where the visibility drops. The bait was positioned about ½ a metre away from the camera, and then it got dragged around a bit on the seabed and ended up on its side up against the wall of the reef. So we've turned the video upside down for you. All right, so eyes peeled from now.
It's a shame we don't have audio because there's a lovely bubbling background.
Here it is being hauled up on deck. So that was a 30-minute deployment on the seabed, and we've condensed it down to about 3 minutes. Right? So you can see that it's not teeming, and you have to be patient when you're looking for this kind of activity. So you imagine the amount of video footage that has to be taken to get a few seconds of footage to be shown on BBC's David Attenborough wildlife programmes. Right? It's that kind of situation. You know, it's not all at once, certainly not at the Surf Reef. So, how do we get on? What did we see?
Crabs.
The crabs. All right, good. I'm glad you saw the crabs. Was it the one crab or two crabs or three? Three? Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
It's difficult to tell from the back, but was the first one a lobster? Just saw something from the back.
I'd have to have a look at that again. I didn't see a lobster myself, but there were two crabs fighting over the mackerel. All right, there's a lot of activity going on, and there was some fighting at times. What about the crab that moved in the foreground? Did anybody recognise it? Not that it's got a particular name, but Brian. I didn't see his name tag, but we'll show it to you again in a minute so you can have a look again. But that was actually a velvet swimming crab. It's got, you may be familiar with the shore crabs that you've seen in rock pools around about. The swimming crab has got a much broader leg at the back. It's also got big red eyes, and believe you me, it gives you quite a nip. If you get your finger in the way, it'll actually draw blood. It's quite a vicious thing. But anyway, there's two of them. They scuttled by, and divers have seen them as well down on the reef. What else did we see?
Pipefish.
A pipefish. There was certainly a fish, a longish fish. We think that's something called a two-spot goby. Again, we have to look through these videos more than once to be absolutely sure, because you know they're fleeting by. When you create a still, it can be a bit fuzzy, but there may be more on that video than we've seen. But certainly the main fish that you see is something called a two-spot goby. If you get really close to the tail, you can see the spot just in front of the tail. Anybody else see anything else? Something waving on the side of the reef was a sea squirt. We'll have a look again in a minute. We'll try and point these things out. See any hermit crabs scuttling on the sand? Lots of those about. There may have been the odd prawn that goes by, but there's so much stuff that's going by all the time that gets caught in the tide. You're not quite sure if it's a prawn or a bit of seaweed or some other rubbish that's going by. But that was done at the end of October. So after a bit of a storm, hence the water was particularly cloudy, and we hope that maybe further deployments in the summer would be perhaps more active. Let's have a look perhaps through a little bit of again, and we'll try and point out one or two things.
Okay.
Shall I stand over?
Yeah, if you go and stand next to it, then you can point on the screen.
I sort of tuck in here.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Go for it.
Okay. And we can speed things up a bit if
Yeah.
necessary. Especially this bit.
Yeah.
Right, so it's on the seabed. So there's some hermit crabs going past there now. There is when the water clears, you might see something on the wall. We'll try and point it out.
Is that something having a go at the...
Yeah, that's a crab.
That's a crab on the bait. So, you know, it found that very quickly actually. That's very early on in the video. Now, there's the velvet swimming crab. Just about see its broader legs at the back there. More activity on the seabed. Up against the wall of the reef, there are lots of these there's cobbles, there's stones, but there is also the non-native slipper limpet which is very common in this area, brought across in the late 19th century from America, but the solent itself is just covered in slip limpets. There's something, if you can point it out from your angle on the wall of the reef, the sea square, because you might be able to see it more easily than me from this
Can
angle.
you see the right down in the far corner?
There we go.
You've got a sort of large rubbery-esque appendage floating in the water.
It is a sea squirt.
It is a sea squirt, yeah.
And there's the crab again. Now, it's got, maybe I'm imagining it, but it's got slightly reddish eyes.
Yeah, they do have really bright red eyes.
I know what I'm looking for. A shrimp. Can you see a shrimp?
There's a hermit crab, a white guy that's sort of pottering around,
Yeah, that's the most activity. Now here we have the little two-spot goby appearing for the first time. There we go. At the top there.
I'll try and stop it when he's close to the camera.
Yeah, it's very difficult to see any more clarity when you stop it on this video.
Yeah, he pops
here's the crab. There's a couple of crabs fighting over the. I mean, maybe a bit of mackerel has dropped down.
Yeah, I've just paused it.
Oh yeah, okay.
You can actually see the goby. Do you want to point out the goby?
Is that it?
No, down a bit. There we go. That's the goby, and if you look, the end to the right of the picture is head, and you can see the eye. The end to the left of the picture is his tail, and you can see the spot, which is how we ID'd it as a two-spot.
Look for the spot when you see it swimming.
Yeah, it's easy to see when he's swimming.
Just about see it in the tail.
Yeah, see him there?
The nice thing about video, it's very quick, is that you can get quite good high-resolution stills which enable you to identify it. And,
this is actually the moving away from the reef, and you can see how quickly it changes. Down here you've still got some of the hermits, and you've also got the invasive slipper limpet. But then after a short period you're sort of back on the sand, which really gives you an idea of what's out there. No, not very much. And we're up again.
We do intend next year, when we hope to do a bit more of this, we'll get some YouTube footage up, and you can see a little bit more. We've done also some work with this bait cam in the seagrass beds in Bourne Harbour, which are it's much clearer actually, remarkably, in those areas. And there's quite a lot of life there, which we'll show you one day. You're on.
Okay. I think I'm on. So those two sort of give you an idea of some of the sort of video we get. One of the sort of points raised by that is whether the Boscombe Surf Reef is being colonised by sort of native or non-native species. Non-native, there are huge numbers of non-native species in the waters, on the sort of terrestrial environment. Some are just present, others are quite sort of destructive. And one of the sort of things that we were thinking about was whether by having finding these non-native species, should we be concerned? Some of the species we found, Stella clava, which is the sea squirt that we showed on the video. Corella eumyota, this is another sea squirt, and actually in sort of aquaculture this can be quite problematic, because where oysters are seeded onto ropes, it can actually attach to the ropes, sort of smothering the oysters. Greta lupea is a red algae that it's something that's not uncommon in this area, which is really what we've thought about all of the non-native species we've recorded. We've recorded no non-native species on the surf reef that haven't been recorded elsewhere in Poole Bay. It's not as if we've got the surf reef and it's got loads of weird species on it. It's more the fact that we're just seeing them because there seems to be a lot of them on the surf reef. And we were thinking, well, why is that? Well, actually the characteristics of a sort of successful non-native invasive species is that you know, they're real good opportunists. They can take advantage of sort of new environments. They're usually quite sort of tough and adaptable. And when you put something new in, obviously this is a new environment where those characteristics give you a bit of a head start. And one of the things that we saw was when we very first looked at the surf reef, we were recording quite a high proportion of these non-natives. And actually as time's gone on, they're still there, just as they're still in sort of other sites around Poole Bay. But they're not dominating, they're not taking over. You know, it's not a case, you know, with aquaculture where it's really a problem. They're just there. And although they're not native species, they're not necessarily problematic invasive species in this context anyway, or at least that's our sort of gut feeling so far. At the end of the day, it's all very nice sort of looking at what's on the reef, and I can talk about all the animals, and it's interesting, but this was a scientific study, and sort of returning to what we were trying to find out, it was looking at how the reef has been colonised, so how it's changed over time, and also how it compares to other sites in the Poole Bay area. And a lot of the quantitative work we did to answer these questions was using video capture and then analysing the photographs. This is analysis of percentage cover of the surf reef over 3 years. So this was starting in 2009 up to 2011. And if you look at the bars, looking at the sort of major features, back in 2009 the surf reef was literally a couple of months old. There was already a lot of sea mats on it. A sea mat is a bryozoan, it's the white fluff you see on kelp. It's the very, very small animals, and it was covered in that, as well as large bare sections with a small amount of algae. Going through the years, you can see that by 2011, by the end of 2011, actually there was a sort of very large proportion of algae compared to these sort of primary colonisers. And obviously we've got further years data, but we haven't worked that up yet. This is a sort of diagram showing communities and at different points across the reef. No need to sort of go into the detail of it, but really what you just want to show is if you actually look at the communities at points on the reef, you can see quite clearly that there's a difference between 2010 and 2011. We also wanted to look at differences between the reef and other structures, and this is a comparison of biological community between the pier and the surf reef on its vertical and horizontal aspects. And as you can see that they're really quite distinct. There's very little sort of, well, there's no overlap, and there's not much really in common between the communities that settled on the pier and those that settled on the reef, so, despite the fact that we've looked separately at the vertical and the horizontal aspects of the reef. So really this sort of suggests that the animals that like the pier aren't necessarily the same animals that like the reef. And again, this is a comparison between the surf reef and the pier over 2011. And whereas the pier is very barnacle dominated, the surf reef's got a lot of red algae, a lot of green algae, a lot of hydroids, as well as other animals in sort of smaller proportions. Which really comes back to sort of the questions that, you know, we were asking, but also the questions for you. So does the biodiversity of the reef differ from other areas in Poole Bay? Could the artificial surf reef alter the fish community? And are the species colonising the reef native or invasive? Roger?
Oh. Right, well I suppose it's over to you really. We've got a few more slides to finish off with, but what do you think? Do you think that the reef is different from anything else that you have heard about, maybe seen from our presentation this morning? Remember that of course the pier has been there a long time. The surf reef has only been completed in about 3 years, and it may well be early days for the surf reef. We might anticipate in the longer term further changes. But any sort of reaction to those questions? Do you think it's good that the reef is there, attracting all this wildlife?
Yes.
Yes. Is that unanimous?
I have a
Is
question
it
about.
relative to the cost?
Sorry, you'd like a
I have
question?
a question about, well, in terms of its benefit, it seems that what its construction is, and it mentioned geotextiles that were used. I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah.
Is it a biodegradable or environmentally friendly substance? That's, I guess, what I'm asking.
Yeah, that's a good question, because we didn't really sort of explain what the geotextiles were, but it's a fairly high-tech man-made fibre, really. It's a geotextile. And the idea is that they're not biodegradable. They've been constructed, these huge long tubes of geotextile bags, pumped with sand, and the idea is that they'll be there forever. So it's not as if the life on the reef effectively necessarily protects the reef for eternity. You know, the reef will only be there for as long as those geotextile bags are there, really. And as we've seen already, they're very vulnerable to being burst and damaged by boats. And already, you know, 2 or 3 of the bags have disappeared, and all the sand just being washed out. One of the bags ended up on Christchurch Ledge, I believe. So yeah, it's very much a man-made structure, and it is vulnerable in that respect. Yeah.
Does that mean, with the this non-biodegradable, does that mean that it would resist any burrowing animals going into it, so nothing can...
That's right. So the animals that Josie showed photographs of, which were burrowing, are burrowing into the sand that's colonised the exterior of the structure. They've not burrowed through the geotextiles. So the nature of the structure is that it's very convoluted and can actually encourage quite a lot of sediment settlement. And so it's in that sediment that the burrowing animals have been recorded.
That said though, Roger, if you think of, for example, some of your sponges,
Yeah.
we've got native sponges around here that can actually bore into
Rock.
limestone, into rock. You know, a lot of the mollusks, for example, feed by sort of boring through the shells of other animals. So although the animals on the reef are pretty small, I think it would be naive of us to underestimate their capacity to get inside if they really wanted to.
How about that then? Possibly boring into the surf reef structure. I think that most of those that we've seen so far are probably on the exterior. But
Yeah,
in the future,
I'd agree.
we never know what might turn up next.
How long does it take a reef to establish itself as a stable environment?
Well, this I suppose is a question which we're trying to answer really. Is, at what point does the colonisation actually become stable? Now, what I think is interesting about the surf reef is that there is forever movement of stuff over the surface. There's already all patches being formed all the time. New stuff is then colonising patches, but then might be some erosion of other patches. If there is regular erosion of colonised patches, then we might expect the reef to look perhaps something like it is now in 10 years' time. It all depends on how stable the existing colonisation is, and whether you get more bigger seaweeds perhaps colonising the structure in the long term, which might stabilise the community itself. It's going to be a long-term project. Yes, sir. Sorry.
How bad is the damage to the bags?
To the bags, I think the latest is that there have been at least 2 of the top bags that have gone.
Have gone?
Yeah. So there is a longitudinal groove in the middle of the surface of the reef.
So does
I've
that
been
mean-
feeling there's another one on its way.
So do they think that they've been split by speedboats and therefore the sand has dissipated and then they've been swept away again?
We think that's what's happened, or the engineers, the commercial divers have been down there to assess the damage. And so yeah, it is vulnerable to that. So, you know, and it will be forever vulnerable unless there's further enforcement or management around the structure.
Is it of your opinion that there's possibly speedboats or boat damage, or do you think there could have been anything else?
We don't go down there regularly enough to sort of find out what's going on. We know that the council is commissions specialist commercial divers who are down there inspecting the reef on a fairly regular basis to determine whether there's any further damage. They've carried out some repairs to the structure as well in the intervening period. But obviously what was on the reef, what was colonising the geotextile bags at the time, that had been gone. So it would be forever vulnerable to that aspect.
Do you know how the geotextile bags affect the environment if they come loose? Are they like plastic bags which appear to be a nuisance to the environment?
As far as I'm aware, the bags that have been burst and damaged have been retrieved and have been taken ashore. It's a fairly mobile environment down there, so I can imagine, I mean, as I mentioned, I think one was retrieved quite a way east towards Hengistry Head, but it did wash ashore. As long as they wash ashore, yes, it's all right. We can find them. Yeah.
Could all the bags that's still full of sand fall off?
No, they're really. It's if you try and imagine them. I was explaining. They're really very solid and they're very, very heavy. If you leave a bag of cement out in the rain and it goes rock solid, when you touch the reef, that's what it feels like. It is just due to the sort of sheer weight, the bags are sort of filled tight, and there's a lot of weight. Now it could subside. It could, you know, I think it could well move and slide, and, you know, if you're talking about it falling off as in sort of a very slow, gradual sort of collapse, that's a sort of feasible scenario. Actually toppling off, just the sheer weight and sort of solidity of it, no. So you wouldn't actually, it could never fall onto somebody if that's the sort of scenario you're imagining, because it's just too solid.
What does appear to be happening, though, is that the reef is sinking slightly. So, and this was anticipated, that it would sink a little bit. And in fact, we gather that that is favouring the surf. The fact that it is a little bit lower, even by a few centimetres now, apparently the surf is saying there's a slightly better wave on it now than there was to begin with. So there may well be some changes in that respect in the long term. Yeah. Yes.
ASR have done a few reefs around the world. I just wondered, you've obviously done a lot of work on it. Any of the other reefs showed significant differences in their biodiversity?
Yeah, as far as we're aware, this is the first surf reef in Europe. Most of the others are in tropical environments. We've never seen any data. We've seen a few pictures. But it's very difficult to get an idea of how successful they have been in terms of their colonisation. The jury's out really in that respect.
Ours has certainly been more surveyed than any of the others. I believe there's a sort of fairly new report coming out on the New Zealand, the double something reef. But no, I mean there's very little. There's obviously a lot of reef studies gone on, but actually the artificial surf reefs, ours is probably considerably more studied than any of the, or at least, you know, in terms of published information out there.
What is interesting about this particular reef is it's on a fairly open coast, and it's in a fairly wave-exposed, obviously, environment. Many other reefs are in deeper water, further offshore, or in sheltered waters. And that changes the whole ball game considerably. So what colonises a reef is very much determined by the local wave energy environment, and in fact the depth of water particularly. And of course whether it's in the tropics or around the UK. But there's a lot of interest in artificial reefs. You've probably heard of Bernie Whittingstall's adventures down in Tor Bay. He's trying to establish an artificial reef in Tor Bay. Not a surf reef, but a multi-purpose reef, perhaps which will store restore the fishery a little bit as well. But there's been a lot of work globally on reefs, and sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. Yes.
You mentioned that the reef is now providing a better way. I think that at some point there will be a decision to clear the species that are colonising in order to get an even better way.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thought. It'd be quite an effort to clear what's there without damaging it, I think. For example, I wouldn't want to put that grab over the top of it. You know, it would be a very difficult thing to clean, I should imagine. I've heard some comments, I don't know about you, Josie, that in fact the divers, the surfers are saying that the actual stuff on the reef is helping in some way. But you know, if it does sink a bit further in the longer term, then it may change the whole nature of the thing in the longer term.
Lady down the front.
Sorry, yes.
We've not got much longer, so we need
Right.
to start wrapping up the questions.
Okay.
But
Just a very quick. You compared the colonisation with the colonisation on Boscombe Pier.
yes,
How rigid is the surf? Because I was wondering whether, obviously Boscombe Pier, the bottom of that is very rigid. Does that make any difference in what can colonise? The fact that the surf reef might be a bit more flexible.
well, I mean, it certainly would. I don't think it's perhaps so much the sort of rigidity, as more the sort of shape and the hydrodynamics that are going to be sort of the influencing factor. I think that's probably what's going on in this case. But you know, obviously that is something that will influence the communities.
I was going to ask, when it was first put forward to use it as a diving reef, how much was that based on research, or was it just to sort of valuable to suggest this sort of kind of what can we do with it? It's not going to stand. That's what I was wondering.
Well, I think because of the disappointment that there has been as far as its function as a surfing reef, I think there has been quite a lot of hard work to sort of determine what value the structure has. In fact, this sort of I was going to sort of have a slide prompt to discuss this. I mean, obviously, a lot of the new structures are being branded as multi-purpose reefs, which might encourage a whole range of different things, including diving, snorkeling, etc. But there are a range of views as to how appropriate it is to encourage diving on this structure. Josie, I know, has a particular view.
Yes, I mean it's just my viewpoint, but I think encouraging it as a dive reef would actually be a very foolish idea. The reason being that it's very shallow water, so I think it could lead people into the sort of illusion that it's 6 meters, which is a real good sort of beginner dive depth. But actually, this is not a beginner dive at all. It's a difficult technical dive if you're an experienced diver. Even if it's flat calm on the top, it's like being in a washing machine underneath. And I have concerns that if it was branded as a sort of a diving reef, whilst it's quite interesting if you're a biologist, and it makes quite an interesting dive, it's certainly not an easy, safe dive for beginners. And I think if you're not a beginner, why on earth would you be diving in 6 meters round here when there's better places to go? So my personal feelings, having dived it, would be that I would rather not see diving encouraged on it, unless for biologists that are particularly interested in looking at the ecology of it, because that aspect of it is very, very interesting. But as a standard dive, it could be dangerous for novices.
We do have a dialogue with the council. We understand that the council is hoping to sort of re-engineer stroke rebrand the seafront into a coastal activity park, and that the reef might be part and parcel of that. There may be ways of adding bits, changing bits in terms of not putting down necessarily new sandbags, but other structures, hard structures, rocks even, which might actually protect the reef, stop boats getting too close, but also create additional interest in the area. And there are also plants for perhaps deeper water as well.
Is that to alter the shape from being the current white elephant that it is there?
Well, I think that they're looking for suggestions, let's say. So if anybody does have any, then don't necessarily pass them to me, but you know who to pass them to. But we, in terms of a broader application, as part of the project, we were linked to another study that is looking at how we can re-engineer structures to encourage wildlife. And of course, the surf reef wasn't designed for wildlife, but of course it's an interesting structure. How do things colonise something like the surf reef in this kind of wave energy environment? And sea walls and breakwaters are something that we're increasingly having to consider more of to protect our coastline. Whilst there's a load of rock dumped on the foreshore, could we perhaps use our knowledge to create special bio-blocks, as they're sometimes called, where there's lots of nooks and crannies in them, little rock pools, etc., in these structures, and insert them into seawalls to actually increase biodiversity. And there's work going on into that. And of course you'll be aware that we're building out offshore more and more. How can we take that, use that to the advantage of marine life to try and help restore fisheries, etc., and biodiversity in general? So our research is sort of feeding into that arena as well.
Okay, well, I think that's a very good place for us to stop.